Emma had always believed in true love. Raised in a modest home, she learned early on the value of hard work and loyalty. Working as an administrative assistant at a large corporation, her biggest dream was to build a family with the man she loved, Matthew. He was charismatic, ambitious, and had that charm that made everyone feel special. To Emma, he was her rock. But to Matthew, she was just a phase. It was a special night. Emma wanted to surprise him. She spent hours preparing a romantic dinner, lighting candles, and setting the table with care. But something felt off. Her messages to Matthew went unanswered. Her intuition screamed at her, a tightening in her chest she couldn't ignore. Then, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it, heart racing, and in that instant, the ground seemed to fall away beneath her. The picture showed Matthew at a fancy restaurant. He wasn't alone. Across from him sat a much younger woman, dressed in a tight dress with a dazzling smile. The two clinked their wine glasses together, looking like a couple in love. Emma's heart raced. The shock was immediate, then it turned into an overwhelming anger. Without thinking, she grabbed a cab and headed straight to the restaurant. When she arrived, what she saw shattered any hope she had left. There was Matthew, holding hands with the woman, laughing and chatting as if nothing else in the world mattered. She couldn't believe it. With determined steps, she approached and, her voice trembling, called his name. Matthew turned around, and when he saw her, his expression changed, but not to the regret Emma had hoped for. No, he smiled. A cruel smile. "What are you doing here, Emma?" he said casually, as if he were talking to a coworker, not the woman he supposedly loved. I saw the picture. How could you? After everything we've been through." The woman beside him chuckled softly, as if the situation were a joke. Matthew leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his wine, and answered with disturbing calmness. "Emma, you're predictable. I was getting tired of your boring little life. Do you really think love holds a man like me? I need someone who lifts me up, not someone who drags me down." The words cut like knives. The humiliation was instant. Emma's eyes burned, but she refused to cry in front of them. The entire restaurant fell silent. Everyone had stopped to watch the scene. Feeling the weight of Matthew's disdain, Emma took a step back. The pain was unbearable. She wanted to scream, to retaliate, to throw the wine in his face. But deep down, she knew none of it would matter. The man standing before her was no longer the Matthew she knew. Or perhaps he never had been. With a heart shattered, she turned and left the restaurant without looking back. The light rain of that cold night hit her face. She felt empty, lost, betrayed, not only by the man she loved, but by everything she had believed in. The drive home was a blur. When she entered, her mother sat on the couch, a concerned look on her tired face. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Emma collapsed. She fell to her knees, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to cry. She cried until her mother embraced her tightly and said with trembling, but certain, voice, "God has a bigger plan for you, my dear. You'll see." But in that moment, Emma couldn't believe in anything. The following days were a blur of pain for Emma. The emptiness Matthew left was suffocating. She could barely eat, barely sleep. The humiliation of that night haunted her thoughts like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. Everything that once felt right in her life now seemed like a lie. But the world didn't stop. Rent needed to be paid, her mother still needed care, and she didn't have the luxury of giving in to her grief. At work, she tried to focus, but the thoughts came like sharp blades. Matthew was living his new life with Rachel, without a hint of remorse, while she tried to piece together her own broken heart. But then, something started to change. First, it was an unexplained fatigue. Then, a sudden dizziness in the middle of her workday. On the third day, she felt intense nausea upon waking. Her heart raced. A thought began to form in her mind, but she refused to believe it. It couldn't be. With trembling hands, she bought a home pregnancy test and returned home, too scared to face reality. But when she saw the positive result, the air seemed to leave her body. Her eyes filled with tears. She was pregnant, with Matthew's child. The shock was immediate. Thousands of thoughts flooded her mind. How would she raise a child on her own? How would her mother, already frail, handle this? And Matthew, did he need to know? Part of her wanted to hide the pregnancy forever, pretend the baby never had a father. But deep down, she knew she had to face it, even if it was only to give him the chance to do the right thing. The next day, she waited for Matthew outside his office. When he appeared, wearing a sharp suit and talking on his phone, Emma felt her stomach churn. He was so calm, so indifferent, while she was destroyed. She took a deep breath and called his name. Matthew turned around, frowning when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" Emma swallowed hard. For a moment, she almost gave up. But then, she placed a hand over her stomach, feeling the small life growing inside her. It wasn't just about her. It was about the baby. "I'm pregnant, Matthew." The silence was deafening. For a second, a shadow of surprise crossed his face. But then he laughed. A dry, mocking laugh. "You think this is going to tie me to you, Emma?" Her face flushed with anger. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." Matthew sighed, bored. "Look, if you want to have this baby, that's your problem. But don't come looking for me. I don't want this child." His words hit like a punch. The contempt in his eyes erased any hope. Emma felt the tears threaten to fall, but she swallowed them. He wouldn't see her cry again. "I was a fool for expecting anything different from you." She turned and left, not giving him a chance to respond. And it was in that moment that she made a decision. She didn't need him. She wouldn't beg for anything. She would raise her child alone. But life still had more surprises in store for her. As the weeks went by, the pregnancy became harder. Exhausting work, concerns about the future, and caring for her mother drained her. Until one day, she fainted at the office. When she opened her eyes, she was in the company's clinic, and a familiar face was watching her with concern. Edward, her boss, a respected businessman, owner of a vast fortune, known for his discretion and impeccable character. He had always been kind to her, but in that moment, his eyes showed something more. "Are you okay, Emma?" His voice was firm but held genuine concern. She tried to smile, but she felt weak. "I'm just a little tired." He studied her for a moment, as if seeing more than what she said. Then, with a serious tone, he spoke. "Come to my office tomorrow. I want to talk to you." Emma nodded, confused about the reason. But deep down, she felt something was about to change in her life. That night, Emma barely slept. Her encounter with Matthew had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. There was no more doubt. She would move on without him. Her child didn't need a father who rejected him even before birth. But now, a new concern consumed her mind. What did Edward want to discuss? He had always been a respectable but distant boss. Why was he suddenly showing interest in her situation? The next morning, still feeling the effects of her fainting spell, Emma dressed as best she could and headed to her boss's office. With each step toward the imposing glass door, her heart raced. She took a deep breath before knocking and, hearing Edward's firm voice permitting her to enter, she pushed the door open. The office was spacious, elegant, with large windows that let the sunlight fill the room. Edward sat behind a dark wood desk, observing her with a serious but warm gaze. "Sit down, Emma," he said, motioning to the chair in front of him. She obeyed, the tension rising. "You passed out yesterday," he continued, folding his fingers together on the desk. "And from what I've seen in your performance reports, you've been working beyond your limits." Emma lowered her eyes. She couldn't deny it. Since finding out about her pregnancy, she'd been working overtime, juggling responsibilities, trying to ensure financial stability before the baby arrived. "I need the job, sir. I can't afford to slow down." Edward stayed silent for a moment, watching her as though measuring every word he was about to say. Then, he leaned back in his chair and said something that took Emma completely by surprise. "I know you're pregnant." Emma froze. Her entire body tensed. "How did he know?" I didn't want this to affect my work," she said quickly, a knot in her stomach. She feared losing her job. But, to her surprise, Edward smiled faintly. "I'm not here to judge you, Emma. Quite the opposite." She furrowed her brow, confused. "I've seen stories like yours. More than you think. And I know that raising a child alone, while surviving in such a ruthless world, isn't easy. But I also know how to recognize someone with the strength to rise above." His words were a balm to her bruised soul. Edward paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Emma felt a rush of emotions flood through her. She had been so lost in her pain, her betrayal, and her own survival that she hadn't considered that someone might truly see her for who she was, not just as a woman scorned, but as someone capable of resilience and strength. "I want to offer you something," Edward continued, his voice calm yet firm. "I know this isn't easy, but I want to help. I'm offering you a position as a senior executive in my company. It will come with a significant salary increase, full benefits, and more stability than you could imagine." Emma blinked, her mind racing. Was this a joke? She could barely comprehend the offer in front of her. A senior executive? It didn't make sense. This was a huge leap, an opportunity she had never even dreamed of. She was still processing everything, from the pregnancy to Matthew's rejection, and now she was faced with this unexpected possibility. "Why?" she asked, almost breathless. "Why me?" Edward leaned forward, his expression serious but not cold. "Because I see potential in you, Emma. You're more than just an administrative assistant. You're intelligent, driven, and capable of much more than you give yourself credit for. And I've watched you struggle. I know you have it in you to succeed, even when the odds are stacked against you. This company needs someone like you." His words hit her like a wave of realization. The weight of his belief in her was humbling, yet inspiring. It wasn't just an offer of a job. It was a lifeline, an opportunity to take control of her future, to redefine herself not just as a mother, but as a woman capable of achieving more than she ever thought possible. I don't know what to say," Emma murmured, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. "I never expected something like this. I've been struggling so much to just get by." Edward's eyes softened, a look of genuine empathy in them. "You don't have to say anything right now. Take your time. But know that the opportunity is there, waiting for you. And if you decide to accept it, I will be here to support you every step of the way. You won't be alone." Emma sat there for a long moment, the words hanging in the air like a promise. She felt as though a door had been opened, one that led into a future she hadn't dared to imagine. The path before her wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a way forward. The days that followed were a blur of contemplation for Emma. She spent hours thinking about her conversation with Edward. The weight of Matthew's betrayal still haunted her, but something within her had shifted. She realized that her future didn't have to be dictated by the man who had abandoned her. She had the power to shape it herself, to build a life not just for her child, but for her own aspirations as well. Emma made the decision. She would take the job. She would rise above her circumstances, not just for herself, but for the child growing inside her. The road would be tough, but it was hers to walk. In the weeks that followed, Emma threw herself into her new role at Edward's company. The transition wasn't easy. She worked long hours, often late into the night, learning the ropes of her new position. But with every challenge, she found herself growing stronger. She took on tasks that once seemed impossible, and with each success, her confidence grew. Through it all, she kept her pregnancy a secret from her colleagues. She didn't want to be treated differently, and she was determined to prove that she could excel in her career despite the challenges she faced. But Edward, ever perceptive, noticed the toll the pregnancy was taking on her. He never once asked her to slow down, but he made sure she had the support she needed. He arranged for her to take breaks when necessary, and even hired a personal assistant to help her with the demands of her new role. As the months passed, Emma's body began to show the signs of pregnancy, but so did her strength. She became more confident in her abilities, her sharp mind and tenacity starting to earn the respect of her colleagues. Her work ethic, coupled with her compassion, made her a force to be reckoned with. She was no longer just the woman who had been left heartbroken by a man she had loved. She was a woman who had found her voice and was ready to make her own way. When the day finally came for her to give birth, Emma was ready. She had built a solid foundation for her future, and though she knew the next chapter would come with its own challenges, she wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned to trust in herself and in the strength that had always been inside her. And when she held her baby in her arms, she knew that no matter what, she would give her child the life she deserved, a life full of love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. As the months turned into years, Emma's career flourished. She became a leading figure in the company, a powerful force who inspired those around her. And though Matthew's name never passed her lips again, she knew that his rejection had been a blessing in disguise. It had forced her to step into the life she was always meant to lead, one that was full of promise and possibility. But the greatest gift of all was the realization that she was no longer waiting for anyone to validate her. She had learned to validate herself. And in doing so, she had given herself and her child a future far brighter than anything Matthew had ever offered her. And so, Emma's journey continued, not as the woman she had once been, but as the woman she had become. A woman who had learned that true strength wasn't found in the arms of another, but in the courage to stand alone.